Okay, let's talk about mirroring. Alright, so I have this model here that is asymmetrical. At some point during my modeling, I decided to just focus on one side, and this is usually more efficient to do than to actually try to model both sides evenly. Um, Most of the times, I find, especially on like a character or a complex object, just to focus on one area and then figure out ways to duplicate or mirror it to symmetrical areas, whether that's a bipedal or bisected symmetrical character like this, where this side, the right side, and the left side are the same, or if you're going for like a radial object where it has multiple copies of something around itself, um, then you'll want to I tend to just focus on one side or one area of that duplication or that symmetry so that I can just duplicate exactly what I did over here onto the other side. Okay. So in order to do this, what you need to do is you need to identify where you're going to be applying your symmetry. Okay, let me turn off the floor for a second. So my symmetry is going along this center line, right? That's where my character is symmetrical across, or it should be symmetrical across this, between this center line. This is really difficult to do if you do not have a center line, right? So if my character was like this, it's pretty challenging, if not impossible, to cut my character in half and apply symmetry from one side to the other side. I'd have to at some point create a symmetry line for my object. Okay. Another thing that's important to note is that your object, depending on how you want to mirror it, you need to make sure that your object either understands that your pivot point or your center of your object is right here, or if this center line is where you're going to mirror across your object is lined up with the world center line. If you turn on your grid, you can see where your world is, right? My character is, let's go back to object mode. If my character is, off center or something like that, then what I'd want to do is, usually what I'll do is, let's say my pivot point, my character is off center and my pivot point isn't in the middle of my character, okay? So usually what I'll do is I'll set my pivot point to be in the middle of my character or lined up with the center line. It doesn't have to be straight in the middle. I can't do, if my character is asymmetrical, I can't really do center pivot because it looks good for a second, but you can tell that's not actually in the middle because it's going by volume, right? So what I need to do is I need to change my pivot point. So I want to go to my move, double click on my move tool to select my tool settings, edit my pivot point. I'll turn on snap to point, and I'll just move this to essentially any vertice along this center line. Okay. It doesn't really matter too much. You might want to move this pivot point based on where you want to rotate the character or something like that, but for mirroring, it just needs to be in that middle mirroring axes, or axes of symmetry. And if you're confused about what I mean by axis of symmetry, let me go ahead and rotate this for a second. Okay. And then I'm going to snap this to the center of my character. Right. Your axis of symmetry, or your plane of, essentially an axis is a plane in space that bisects one of the main orientation directions, right? So by default, let's go to world. By default, you have the y is up, z is forward, and x is left and right. And then essentially this axis is something that cuts one of the directions in half. So in the x direction, this plane is cutting my character in half, right? And so I can think of that axis or that plane as a space bisecting my character, right? So on one side, it's going to be a copy of my mesh. On the other side, it should be the exact same copy, okay? So that's what my center line of my character is, or my object is lining up with, right? And that's going to make my mirroring perfect, right? So usually you don't actually have to see a plane like this. You just have to keep in mind how you're mirroring from one side of your mesh to the other side and how that line lines up with that plane, right? So let's say my mesh was a little wonky, right? So my center line isn't perfect. You're not like you haven't done mirroring a whole lot, and so you're not really taking into account the center line on your character or your object, right? So let's say it's something like this. Okay, let's try mirroring my character. So I'm going to go to Mesh, Mirror. I can open the mirror settings. Let's just go ahead and see if I can reset my settings. Okay. By default, I don't really care about using cut geometry. It sometimes works. It's if your mesh is cut in half and you only have half your mesh, and you have like a cut line and then something is on the left hand side or on the bad side or the cut side of your mirroring line, it will trim it down. But I've found that this isn't very reliable to rely on, so I just turn that off. Okay. Copy is fine. We want to keep it to copy. Mirror axis, this is really going to depend on how our mesh is set up. Okay, we'll take a look at that in a second. Mirroring axis is, if you're mirroring up and down, left to right, or forward and back. So it depends on how your character is symmetrical. My character is symmetrical along the x-axis, so I'm going to keep it x. Mirror direction is going to be going from positive to negative or negative to positive. In this case, it's going to go from positive to negative. Combined with original, you want to do this as well if you want it to be one mesh again. If you want to mirror your character and have it so when you mirror your character that they are going to, when you mirror it across, it's just going to flip it to the other side and stitch it back together, you'll want to combine with original and merge with border vertices. So what that's going to do is when I mirror it across, any vertices that are in the middle or close to each other, they're going to stitch back together. Personally, I like to set my merge threshold to custom and just leave it to 0.0010. What that's going to do is it's going to prevent really, really small vertices or vertices that are really, really close together, kind of like, these ones aren't really, really close together, but they're close enough together that if I do automatic, there's a good chance that those ones that are close to the center are going to merge together. So I feel like custom with a really low value is going to be, it's only going to merge vertices that are right on top of each other. But it's up to you. You might have yours, it might be a really big mesh, or your vertices might be well spaced together, and then that way you don't have to actually worry so much about stitching together those middle points. Okay, let's just see what happens when I do this apply, right? Okay, a couple things to note. First is that my mesh is mirroring across the world. And the reason why that is because my mirror axis position is set to the world and not my object. Like the center of my object might be right here, but the center of the world is over here, so it's going to flip my copy or my mirrored version of my mesh onto that other side. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix that first. Go back. I'm going to click on object. I'll just double check my mesh. Yep, there's my center line. It's in the middle right there. Click apply. Set that back to object. Click apply. There we go. And so we can see it did that. But if I go in here and move, you'll see I actually have two copies of my mesh, right? So what's happening is because my mesh isn't connected, or I didn't delete this half, what it does is it just duplicates and flips my mesh, so I actually have two copies of that same bird on top of each other, so that's definitely not what we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the half I don't like, which is this side over here, right? I need those arms and legs on the other side, so I don't need this other half. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select half of my mesh. Easy way to do that is just go to the front and just click and drag through your mesh. And you can see because my mesh is asymmetrical, or I have this center line that's going across like that, I'm getting some of the other ones on the good side I don't want, so I'm going to get rid of those ones. Right, and whenever I do this, I usually double check around and just making sure I'm selecting only half my mesh. Okay, delete. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we are going to apply that mirror. Okay, now I'm going to turn on smoothing so we can kind of see what's going on here. So we can see here, right there, that mesh isn't actually welding together because those vertices are too far apart, but you can see right here, when it made that duplicate, it welded those guys back together, right? Stitched this side and that side back together at that location. These areas where it hasn't is because those vertices are too far apart. So what we're going to do is, I'll show you guys what the, with automatic, or we'll do automatic and see what that does. Let's click apply. Wrong button. Okay. Object, select my object, click apply. Okay, you can see with automatic, it actually welded some of those guys together, and I could probably try to increase the merge threshold. And you can see after I increase it, you can, it starts to auto grab from that center and get them. But you'll start to notice in some areas, I'm not sure if this is actually going to show it, because so far it looks like it's okay. I'm definitely getting something weird going on up here, but it's hard to tell what that is. And I can tell inside my mouth that there's something else going on. Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay. I think I can see what's happening in here is I have an interior shelf of my lip, right? I just extruded it back and then extruded it up. But as this gets higher, you can start to see it's merging that together. So the merging is very unpredictable if you use the merge threshold at a higher number. So what I like to do instead, something that's way more predictable, is just select all of your center edges, so the edges that go through the center of your object. You can see here I have some leftover faces from when I was trying to delete my mesh. So let me go ahead and delete those guys. All right. Delete half my mesh, there we go. That's probably why I was looking funky earlier. Just delete these guys. I don't need anything on that side of the center line. Same thing with these ones. Okay. And yeah, it looks like these guys are still present. Okay. That's why it's important to go around and check carefully. Okay. So then what I like to do is I like to just grab the center line. In this case, it's automatically selected for me, but a lot of times it won't be, so just double click the center line. You'll see if you have if your center line is intersecting like a cavity or a mouth or something like that, you start to get these edges over here, which I don't want, right? So I'm just going to deselect those guys. All right. And so with these guys selected, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten them towards the center, right? So I can just flatten them like that. The problem is a lot of these vertices, like these ones up here, are already in the center of my character, but these ones down here are not. They're either on the right-hand side or left-hand side. And so by default, your pivot point for your selection is going to be an average between these vertices positions and this x-axis. So this center point is kind of shifted over a little bit to the right. So that means when I scale them in, the vertices that are actually on the center are going to kind of pull out of the center, which I don't want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap so I'm going to turn on, press D to edit my pivot point, or click it right here. Click on snap to point. I want to snap it to a vertex that I know is actually in the center of my character. Turn that off. Turn off snap to point or vertex. And then now you'll see those vertices and edges that are actually in the center are not going to move, but all the other vertices that are off kilter, like those ones in the middle, are actually snapping now to the middle. Okay, so now I can select my character, and I'm going to go back to my mirroring options, and then I'm just going to click apply. I want to set to custom 0.0010, click apply, and then what's going to happen is I'm going to turn on smoothing. You'll see because all of my edges were lined up perfectly in the middle, and my smoothing or my merging threshold was really low, I get a perfect mirror across, right? Okay, let's grab my character. I'm going to untranslate him. If I need to bring my character back to the center, what I can do is I can, and let's say I didn't have my translate value still there, what I could do is I can make sure my object's pivot point is somewhere in a center line, right? And then what I can do is I can turn on snap to grid. And I can just drag him in the x-axis, and he's going to snap to each of these grid points in the x direction. And I can keep doing that until I get him to the center, lined up with the center of my scene. Okay. All right. So how do you merge an object like this, right? So this is something that this is a separate object, and I want to merge another separate object. I don't want them to be combined together. So what I can do is I can turn on a copy. I'm going to unclick combine with original. And in this case, because my pivot point is not in this, it might be in the center scene, but I didn't model this with the center of the scene in mind, so it probably isn't. What I probably want this to do is be mirrored across the world. So when I click apply, what it's going to do is it's going to make a copy of that object and mirror it across the world. But this is now a separate object, right? I can do the same thing with this one right here, click apply. Okay. So if you have any objects that aren't connected and you need to duplicate it from one side of the world to the other side of the world, then what you can do is you can turn on mirror axis to world, and you can unclick combine with original so that's a separate object. So that's the basics of mirroring, especially mirroring across one plane to the other plane. If you're interested in getting a radially symmetrical object, so an object that is symmetrical in a radial axis, kind of like a chandelier or a wheel, right? Those would be symmetrical across a radial axis. Then I recommend checking out the radial video that I posted as well. Okay, so that's the basics of mirroring.